Okay, can everybody see it? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So yeah, before I begin, I want to give a big thank you to Professor Fortney for organizing this. Thank you to, oh no, it's starting. Let's not do that. Okay. Thank you to Professor Seeger for guiding me through the research process, and a big thank you to everyone for taking the time to attend. Okay, so let's get started. I hope it doesn't play itself automatically. I'm worried about that. Okay. So the title of my research project is The Axiology of Panpsychism. So some research questions I have are as follows. Okay, so the first question that this project sought to ask is, what does it mean for something to be valuable? Some other questions include, what is consciousness? Is consciousness valuable? Is it possible for something to be valuable without a valuer? Or is value derivative from consciousness? For example, is a world with no observers still valuable? That's a big question. Some other questions are, what is panpsychism? Does panpsychism entail that nature is pervasively valuable? And if nature is pervasively valuable, what are some implications? Okay, so to begin, there are some concepts that I want to cover that are important to know before we get into the rest of the project. So the concepts are axiology, consciousness, and panpsychism. So axiology is the broad discipline of inquiry that investigates values, their nature, variety, and interrelationships. Commonly, for example, it's the relationships between truth, beauty, and morality. Consciousness, while a contentious subject, and it's hard to pin it down definitively from this point generally to understand it, it would be an individual's first-person experience of the world. And last, panpsychism. So panpsychism is a thesis that all physical existence is imbued with an inner principle that can be described in terms of subjectivity. So in this case, consciousness would be that inner principle or inner feature or a fundamental feature, different ways of thinking about it, but basically the same idea. Okay, so this is my thesis and research approach, so kind of like an outline of what to expect. So in this project, I'm defending the position that using the paradigm of the panpsychist, the intrinsically valuable nature of consciousness is going to entail the intrinsic value of basically everything, of all entities. So first, I'm going to characterize the version of consciousness that is under consideration and how it is axiologically relevant. I will examine reasons to believe that consciousness is or is not valuable. Here, I will be considering some objections to the value of consciousness. Next, I defend the plausibility of panpsychism as a thesis through a discussion of panpsychism over the ages or the centuries and how panpsychism solves current problems in the philosophy of mind. And then finally, I will argue that on this picture, given everything so far, value is pervasive insofar as everything is constituted by consciousness, and consciousness has intrinsic value. Okay, so first let's characterize the kind of consciousness that we're talking about. So in mainstream philosophy of mind, there are two predominant theories of conceptions of consciousness that kind of interact with each other and work together. So one is phenomenal consciousness and the other is access consciousness. So to begin, phenomenal consciousness is the kind of consciousness that this paper in particular is concerned with. However, it's important to distinguish between these two types. So phenomenal consciousness is when there is something that is like to be in that state. So up here, I have a picture of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. So for example, the experience of being in a concert hall, listening to a symphony combines different sensory modalities to produce something it is like to be in that state, okay, such as this. Whereas on the other hand, access consciousness is the ability to access cognitive events such as memories or skills. Okay, so with the same example, if we are having the experience of retrieving a memory in the past of us having gone to the concert hall and experiencing a symphony, that would be an access conscious event, okay? So anytime that we're engaging our cognitive apparatus, we are using our access consciousness. So if that's us thinking or planning into the future, etc. Okay, so now let's characterize value. So in the same way, there's kind of these two modes of consciousness, there's these two modes of value. So those are instrumental value and intrinsic value. Instrumental value means that something is good as a function of what it can do, or it is derivatively valuable. So it's valuable as dependent on something else. So I have a picture of stairs here. So for example, the value of stairs is that they allow you to get from point A to point B. Intrinsic value, on the other hand, is good in and of itself. It's non-derivatively valuable. So for example, some of you may be familiar with Kantian ontology. So Kantian dignity is valuable in and of itself. So if something has dignity, it's valuable in virtue of that. Okay, so within value, I alluded to earlier, there being kind of these three types of value broadly construed. So the first is epistemic value, moral value, and then aesthetic value. So epistemic value is goodness as it relates to knowledge or truth. So one way to think about this is knowledge, what's good about knowledge is it helps us solve problems like create vaccines or build infrastructure or, learn about the Big Bang. Moral value is goodness as it relates to actions. So referring back to our example of Kantian deontology, treating those that possess dignity, knowing to treat those that possess dignity with kindness and respect is a moral good. And then finally, aesthetic value is goodness as it relates to beauty. So I have a picture of, Michelangelo here, but we can also think of things like the Rocky Mountains. Is when we're experiencing those things, they kind of induce this pleasant phenomenal affect, like awe or, the sublime. And in cases such as those things possess aesthetic value. All right, so now that we have characterized, different kinds of consciousness, different kinds of value, let's look at the value of phenomenal consciousness, the consciousness at issue here. So one way to, think about whether or not phenomenal consciousness can be construed as valuable, a common way of doing this, is the zombie thought experiment. It's a very popular thought experiment. So it goes as follows. Imagine yourself duplicated via a science fiction duplication machine. I know I have the transporter here, but bear with me. However, wow, the person that comes out of the duplicator has the same physical attributes, the same abilities, the same psychological makeup. It is missing one crucial feature, their phenomenally conscious experience. They have fully intact access consciousness, so as we described before, these cognitive capacities, but no phenomenal consciousness. So now ask yourself, would you comfortably trade lives with this zombie twin or duplicate of yours? Is there a difference between somebody close to you and their zombie twin? Intuitively, it seems, at least normally, that taking the life of your zombie twin or having someone close to you switch places with a zombie twin seems akin to their death or your death. And this suggests something about personhood as well. So it seems like, phenomenally conscious experience is somehow tied to personhood, which will be important later. Therefore, the thought experiment demonstrates that phenomenal consciousness or a phenomenally conscious experience is valuable separate from its instrumental value that access consciousness provides. Okay. All right, so there's the first objection to the value of phenomenal consciousness is by Levi, where he argues that my zombie twin has a point of view. He sees the world from a particular perspective in an attitude-infused way. Indeed, his idiosyncratic take on things is identical to mine. He is inclined to say that he values things, and I am inclined to agree with him. So in response to this objection, I want to be clear that a zombie twin, hypothetically, would only be able to act on stimulus inputs from the external world and respond with the requisite behavioral output. So this would be analogous to like a super sophisticated robot, as I have pictured here, via its access conscious experience. So the zombie twin would be making decisions identical to your own, based on its cognitive representations. However, it is not consciously aware of the decisions that it's making in this phenomenal sense, in this what it's like sense. So hence, there is nothing that is like for your zombie twin to have attitudes towards things in the way that we normally construe it. Okay, so next, we're going to be considering whether or not phenomenal consciousness is intrinsically valuable, okay? So I'm going to be considering both, all of it, it's whether it's epistemically valuable, whether it's morally valuable, and whether it's aesthetically valuable. So let's consider the intrinsic epistemic value of phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so Bourget puts forward his phenomenal theory of epistemic grasping. Okay, so he's discussing this phenomenon of being able to grasp information from the world. So to define the theory, he states, To currently grasp P is to have a phenomenal experience with P as content. Our phenomenal experience allows us to grasp the content of a proposition, okay? So, for example, that is when we are given a proposition such as the sun is 1,300,000 times bigger than the earth, we grasp Q and not P, okay? So there's something different about just hearing that proposition and fully understanding it. Like we don't have a real conception of what that means. To grasp P, or to grasp the content of the proposition, we need to have a representative model, such as an apple seed versus a basketball, or this picture that I have here maybe. Grasping is one way in which consciousness is intrinsically epistemically valuable because it gives the subject presentational phenomenology whereby the subject seems to be aware of the truth maker of P, right? We've gained something through grasping the content of the proposition via a representational model or what have you. And that is just in virtue of our phenomenally conscious experience. Okay, so next is the intrinsic moral value of phenomenal consciousness. So as we referred to earlier, Kantian deontology situates personhood, dignity at the center of moral consideration. Okay, Kriegel argues that the ground of dignity is precisely phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so how we can determine whether or not something has dignity is whether or not they have a phenomenally conscious experience. Moreover, I argue, adding on to Kriegel, our understanding of personhood, dignity, and phenomenal consciousness indicate that they are all inextricable, right? So we talked about, the zombie thought experiment where, personhood seems intertwined with phenomenal consciousness and dignity seems intertwined with personhood. So given that that's the case, Kriegel states, on the emergent view, an entity exacts respects and merits treatment as an end just if it is a phenomenally conscious creature, okay? Such as all the creatures displayed here. So concisely, any entity with phenomenal consciousness has moral value. Okay, and then last is the intrinsic aesthetic value of phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so the aesthetic intrinsic value of consciousness, Kriegel argues, can be arrived at through contemplation of the so-called explanatory gap between phenomenal consciousness and the rest of the natural order. A certain intellectual type of awe descends on us, akin to the experience of the sublime. Okay, so as I talked about earlier, the sublime, is this feeling that we get in the presence of something, aesthetically valuable. When consciousness contemplates its own nature, consciousness induces awe. And being a fitting object of awe, if being a fitting object of awe is the mark of the sublime, then consciousness is intrinsically aesthetically valuable. Okay, so in considering its own nature, consciousness induces awe, therefore consciousness is aesthetically valuable or intrinsically aesthetically valuable. Okay, so the first criticism of the intrinsic value of consciousness is levied by Savulescu and Cayenne. They argue with respect to individuals experiencing a locked-in state, so people who have no ability to act on their environment, so awake from their state, etc. They state the totally locked-in brain damaged patients we are now considering have no capacity for communication, no external agency, and at most only a limited and completely passive perceptual input. Their lives have gone very badly since entering into the state, and if it continues unaltered, may go on very bad. It is far from obvious that such lives are worth living. If so, then even if using fMRI, we can establish that a brain damaged patients still enjoy phenomenal consciousness, terminating these patients' lives might be morally required, not merely permitted. Okay, so this implies that when you're in this state, somehow the intrinsic value of consciousness is negated, right? So there's no, as in virtue of falling into the state, the now intrinsic value of your consciousness has been void. So on to the next slide. In response, I grant that in cases such as these, the instrumental value of conscious agency is made null by the locked-in state. Moreover, the state could demonstrate too intense a burden to continue living as a result. Okay, so assuming that, this isn't always the case, right? So if any of you have heard of the diving bell and the butterfly, some locked-in patients have been able to, make instrumental use of their consciousness. But let's say in most typical cases, this is not true, and most people don't have any instrumental ability with their conscious experience. So this line of, but regardless, this line of argumentation does not demonstrate a case where consciousness is made intrinsically disvaluable. What happens in these cases is that the locked-in state diminishes the instrumental value of consciousness so much so as to proportionately outweigh its intrinsic value. So while consciousness retains its intrinsic value, it potentially could be possible that it would be morally required to terminate the lives of these people if, the loss of instrumental value poses such a significant burden on their lives. But it is important to characterize the experience, to accurately characterize the experience of locked-in patients. So a clinical study done by Damasio surveyed patients subsequent to their coming out of a locked-in state to report on their experience. The study found that the majority of patients described the state as either tranquil or calm. Okay. All right, so another criticism. So criticism 2 of the intrinsic value of consciousness was forwarded by Lee, which relies on hedonic valence as an indicator of value. So whether or not something is pleasurable or something is painful. Okay, so usually we see something as, if it feels good, it's valuable. If it feels bad, it's disvaluable. He states, when a philosopher in hell thinks about the axiology of consciousness, they might be drawn towards neither a positive view nor a neutral view. Okay. But instead the negative view, according to which consciousness is intrinsically disvaluable. Okay, so to respond, I'm not arguing that pain is intrinsically valuable or disvaluable. Pain is instrumentally valuable or disvaluable. We experience pain physiologically to give us information about whether or not we should avoid certain stimulus or approach certain stimulus in the case of pleasure. And while chronic pain, for example, doesn't necessarily give us useful information about our environment. And, in cases such as those, there are these exceptions where, maybe the pain is so demonstrably disvaluable that you could say that maybe consciousness is rendered intrinsically invaluable. But I want to make note that the intrinsic value of, phenomenal consciousness is that it confers epistemic information about the world, right? So it tells us something about the world. And the intrinsic value of consciousness does not turn on and off as a function of pain and pleasure that we experience, or at least that's what I'm arguing. Okay, so on to panpsychism. So panpsychism is actually quite a prominent view in the philosophy of mind, and it has been for a very long time. Even, pre-Socratic philosophers have contemplated panpsychism. But here I'm just going to briefly go over, some places where, panpsychist ideas can be found. So to begin, ancient philosophy. So I'm not suggesting that Aristotle was necessarily a panpsychist, but he has stated in places that all existing things seek their own special good, right? So anything that exists kind of has this reasoning tendency or this want to better itself, which is interesting. Renaissance philosophy. Moving on, Cavendish argued that all parts of nature, even inanimate, have innate and fixed self-knowledge, and it is probable that they may also have an interior self-knowledge. Okay, so a little bit more suggestive of panpsychist tendencies. And famously, Spinoza argued for a variation on panpsychism known as pantheism or substance monism, where all apparent individuation in nature was the result of different modes of nature's intrinsic content and taken on by this one substance, i.e. God. Okay, and God has this consciousness property. Okay, and then finally on to modern philosophy, a proponent of panpsychism, Goff, argues that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter. Moreover, panpsychism is valuable in that it aims to solve modern problems in the philosophy of mind, including the hard problem of consciousness and the problem of the intrinsic nature of matter. Okay, so some objections include to panpsychism include that it's contrary to common sense, right? So maybe one that you've heard, maybe one that you're contemplating is like, well, how can rocks be conscious? That's absurd. So that's one criticism. Another is, how does consciousness combine, right? So if we're positing consciousness as this fundamental feature of reality, it's not really, some people will argue it's not solving the hard problem, it's just making a new problem. This doesn't solve anything. And then finally, what a conscious subject is arbitrary. So even if we grant that, some things are more conscious, more or less conscious, and we're saying that rocks maybe aren't, where do we draw the line? How do we know what's conscious and what isn't? Okay. Or what is more or less conscious? Okay. So in response to these objections, I want to argue in favor of the plausibility of panpsychism, and that it is, in fact, a plausible position on the philosophy of mind. So the first response to common sense is by Goff. He responds that, common sense has often led us astray. For example, other common sense theories, like the geocentric model of the universe, for example, has led us astray. It's proven incorrect. So common sense isn't necessarily the best indicator of what's true and what's false. Response to the combination problem, March argues that the fusion view of metal combination does a good job of solving this problem. So it states that when micro or proto-conscious entities come together in the right way, okay, so this kind of fusion characteristic, this fusion property obtains, together they form a single unified consciousness. Hence, the combination problem can be solved by positing fusion conditions for complex consciousness. And then finally, the response to the arbitrary subjects problem, Roelofs argues that all elementary particles are associated with incredibly simple experiences whose structure is no more complex than the structure of those particles' physical properties. Okay, hence at the most fundamental level, what exists there can be considered a microsubject, but that microsubject's level of subjectivity is quite rudimentary. Okay, so stringing it all together, putting everything that we've discussed so far, the axiology of panpsychism. So the intrinsic value of consciousness in panpsychism, I have argued, entails the value of all beings, from the most fundamental entity, whether that be microentities such as quarks or fields, to macroscopic combinations of those entities, such as brains or planets. On this picture, value is pervasive insofar as everything is constituted by consciousness, and consciousness has intrinsic value. That is, consciousness is intrinsically valuable in that it has the requisite moral, epistemic, and aesthetic axiological features. Furthermore, there is good reason to believe that consciousness may be the ground of all value, since consciousness allows for valuers. Panpsychism argues consciousness is the most primitive constituent of nature. So if we adopt panpsychism, then there are valuers at every level of reality. Moreover, since consciousness is reflexive, we can reasonably claim that nature itself is valuable. All right, so to conclude, there are a few implications that result from this view. Many, I'm sure, that are coming to your mind. Like, what does it mean that everything is conscious? Does that mean that we can't, engage with the world? Is a potential problem? Like, how can I know how to treat rocks if I know that they're conscious? Well, if we accept combinationism or the fusion view of panpsychism, then we can accept that there are gradients to conscious experience, because complex consciousness is a result of specific relations between micro-conscious parts, okay? If those relations do not obtain, then the conscious parts remain rudimentary. Therefore, we can continue to suppose that rocks are not conscious in the way that animals are conscious, and so forth, okay? However, this doesn't mean that it doesn't change anything. So with respect to our engagement with entities, Matthews argues that if not only human beings are other self-realizing systems, or selves, including the world as a whole, are understood as subjects rather than as pure objects, then perhaps encounter should be seen as the appropriate mode for relating with the world at large. Thus, cultivating an attitude of accepting and appreciating the world as it is will engender respect and sympathy toward whatever we encounter as a function of its unique, place in the world, role in the world. That's everything. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you for a really interesting